Good evening and welcome. I'm Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association, and it is our great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our series by the Humanities New York grant that is supporting us, and it's being facilitated by Sandy Brewster Walker. I welcome everyone, and this is the second program in our second series program, The Legacy of Long Island's First Peoples, the Eugenics Study of Long Island's Native Americans. I'd like to introduce Sandy, her little bio. She is a facilitator of the program and actually put it together and is doing a wonderful job. It's a pleasure cooperating and collaborating with her. Sandy Brewster Walker is an independent historian, a genealogist, a freelance writer, and business owner. She has served in President William Jefferson Clinton's administration as Deputy Director of the Office of Communications, United States Department of Agriculture. As a member of the Montaukett Indian Nation, she is the Executive Director and Government Affairs Officer. Along with Chief Robert Barrow, she is leading the nation through the reinstatement and recognition process by New York State and the U.S. federal government. There's much more to Sandy, which I know, and you will discover that as you hear her further on in the program. She will add her intense knowledge of all things Native American on Long Island, and she will certainly add a depth and breadth to the conversation that we're having tonight. And our speaker tonight, I would like to welcome Dr. John Strong. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. And I'd like to say a few words of introduction for you, and then I will turn the program over to Sandy. Dr. John Strong, PhD, is a noted historian and scholar of American studies and has been hailed as, quote, the leading ethno-historian on Long Island. After more than 50 years of teaching, researching, lecturing, and publishing, he wrote, America's Early Whalemen, Indian Shore Whalers on Long Island, 1650 to 1750. Strong is also the author of numerous other books, as well as many scholarly articles about the history, culture, and heritage of the Long Island Native American community. So without further ado, I will once again welcome all of you in our audience and ask you to sit back and enjoy the wonderful presentation that we have tonight. And at the end of their remarks, we will have questions and answers. So write down your engaging questions, and we hope to hear from many of you at the closing of our program. So Sandy, I turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being the facilitator for this program.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm going to be very brief too tonight. I did quite a few slides and I went back and cut them all out. So I'm down to 2. But the reason why I selected John, because he's a great friend and we all know him and he's a great scholar, but also he wrote the book about the Montaukett Indian Nation, and I've been trying to connect the dots. And his book has really helped me connect the dots. And I've been asking him also a lot of questions on eugenics. And in fact, a few years ago, before the pandemic, pre-pandemic, I went with my cousin Denise Shepard over to the Cold Spring Harbor not the research center that was there. And we kind of toured it, and they told us a little bit and told us where the records had been transferred to. But getting back to connecting the dots, all of a sudden this light bulb went off in my head about eugenics and the judge Abel Blackmore. He was the one that ruled against the Montauketts, and the appeal and the our defeat up until 1936. And I also saw that in 1910, as John will tell you, that's the same year we had our case, and it's the same year they started this eugenics study. This is just a group of Montaukets that during that period went down to Washington, D.C. on our behalf. And John, I'm looking forward, like everyone else, to your talk. So I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, Cynthia, for organizing this. And connecting the dots maybe is a good way to start. I think always of William Faulkner's saying that the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. And I'm looking at the evidence that supports Faulkner's wisdom, because here we see clear evidence that the past is still causing serious consequences on the present. The history of institutional racism and so forth, and the whole body of scientific racism is evidence of that. And I'm going to speak briefly about the origin of this scientific racism movement, which we call now eugenics, and to look at the consequences of this ideology and the damage that it continues to do, and the real serious problem for our country if we ignore the history of, in particular, of racism and of institutional racism. These are classic examples of that. And the decision that Sandy's referring to, the Montaukets, is one of the other consequences of that eugenics ideology, which was being read, I think, by Judge Blackmer in 1910. That's the time when these ideological propositions were beginning to get publicity mainly through the eugenics movements and so forth. But my talk is going to be a briefly statement of those institutions and their emergence and the consequences for four particular consequences: case studies on the Unkachog, and of course Sandy mentioned the Montaukets are yet another example of how the past unfortunately remains alive. The beginning of this ideology of scientific racism really was traced back to Samuel George Morton. In 1839, he published a book called Crania Americana, in which he proposed that the races of mankind could be neatly divided into three. The whites, of course, superior; the brown, meaning the Indians, Ethiopians, Asians, and so forth; and the black on the bottom. And this ideology was not, or this concept was not new, but what Morton wanted to do was to find what he would propose is scientific evidence to support those views, which had been around since probably since time immemorial. And he was laboring, in a sense, to apply the scientific method to this question. But he turned the scientific message upside down. In other words, the scientific method, of course, is you have a hypothesis, and you try to prove that hypothesis with experiments and with research, and then you come to your conclusion, which either supports it or doesn't support it. What Morton and Hrdlicka and the other scientists in this time period did was a priori. They had their conclusion and they turned upside down, and they looked for reasons that might support it, rather than doing what was really scientific research. And that's why the term scientific racism comes in. It demonstrates the contradiction in that very statement. And this, and once again, the Faulkner's comment that the past has not died is in an article that came out just last Monday in the Washington Post about the Smithsonian activities soon after the death of Morton in the 1840s by Ailes Herdlicka. He was a physical anthropologist who served in the Smithsonian as the director of their Department of Physical Anthropology. And what he did was to begin to collect more skulls. Morton had proposed that the difference between the races was simply one of intelligence. The whites were smarter than the browns and the blacks. And his method for proving that, if you can use that word, was to examine the intelligence. The argument was they were superior because they were more intelligent. How do you determine intelligence? Well, he came to the conclusion that the size of the brain, physical size of the brain, would determine intelligence. That is still debated to some extent, and with no conclusion about whether or not brain size is indicative of intelligence. There are all sorts of correlations that have never really been proven. But Morton decided that he would take as many skulls as he could find from archaeological sites and hospitals, wherever he could find them, and fill the skulls up with first with birdseed and then with shot, and then measure it to find out what the cranial measurements were. And what he came up with, conveniently for him at any rate, was that Caucasian brains cavities were 87 cubic inches. Indians, Ethiopians, Pacific Islanders, Chinese lumped together in what we call the middle were 80 cubic inches, and Negroes and lower 78 cubic inches. These, of course, were arbitrary. He also was accused of playing with the skulls to, if there was a fairly large African American skull, he would fill it maybe not sort of lightly, but if it was a small Caucasian slide, he would force the bird seed down compact so he could get more in it to bring him to the conclusion that he wanted. That's just the way the game was being played. And this was continued in at Smithsonian for most of that century up until the 1940s. And the research that was done on by the Washington Post reporters, they looked at all the Smithsonian statistics, they looked at all these records, and they found one of their element, and that's what I ran onto also with the eugenics movement files that I looked at. The real ethical issue here was that few of any of those, the families, the descendants of those skulls, people whose skulls had been taken, were ever notified that their brains, their skull cavities, and indeed something like 30,000 body parts from 80 countries around the globe are in the Smithsonian. They're still there in the Smithsonian repository. The one is right down here where I live at Sweetland. And the reporters, I have to give them credit, they worked on this for several months, and they highlighted this all this in a sense with one particular case study. A Sami woman. Sami are the people who herd reindeer in the northern Arctic areas. She had, in the 1933, her mother had needed cataract surgery, and she came down to Seattle, and the doctor who gave her the cataract surgery happened to be one of the enthusiasts of this scientific racism about, and he knew about this collection of skulls. Her daughter, Mary Sarah, died while she was there died of tuberculosis while she was in Seattle. And the doctor, Friedman, agreed to take care of her expenses and the burial and so forth. And he would take over the body, in effect. The mother went home, and the doctor, in a sense, took advantage of this. He removed the brain of the 18-year-old girl and wrapped it up and sent it off to Smithsonian, and it's there now. And they proceeded to bury the body without the brain, without telling the parents, without telling any of the relatives. These reporters from, and this is all in an exclusive in the Washington Post, as I said, it came out last Monday. They tracked down these people and the descendants, not only of Mary Sarah, but many of the others as well. And the bottom line is, here we see again an example, the consequences of the past, of all these ideologies and so forth, that and the poisonous consequences in this regard. Now, during the time when these remains were being collected and put into the various categories and in the Smithsonian, and it's interesting that Hrdlicka, who was born about the time that Morton died, picked up on this theme, and he was also a highly educated physical anthropologist, and he started to pose a different kind of issue. He was thinking, well, what would happen if one of these, a member of the superior race, were to have a child by a member of an inferior race? What would be the consequences of that? And again, without any evidence, he assumed that the consequences would create, in effect, or produce, a better word, I guess, an inferior race incapable of sustaining civilization, and capable of maintaining and sustaining humans, what amounted to really white civilization. And that therefore action needed to be taken to, first of all, to demonstrate that this was in fact the case, that mixed races were by definition, in a sense, inferior. And so once again, the reverse scientific method was wheels were set in motion. What he proposed and what he began to, he actually acted out, was to find evidence that this was indeed the case, and to examine mixed race populations to prove that they were indeed inferior to the so-called pure, in this case, the white race. And he convinced two, and this is a lesson, this, I suppose, two Ivy League professors, Charles Darwin from Harvard, and Charles Davenport from Harvard, and Harry Laughlin from Princeton, both PhDs. And they went on, in a sense, became the pioneers in the development of eugenics. And this was beginning to take shape. In 1910, those two men met for the first time, and they established the Eugenics Office, the one that Sandy mentioned, in Cold Harbor. It was financed actually by the Mary Harriman, the wife of the widow, I guess, of the railroad tycoon who developed the railroads across across the country, and the Carnegies and the Davenport. Again, they had, as I said, had impressive resumes, and they contacted the Harrimans and the Carnegies, and what they presented, we don't know the exact details, but the notion that this would prove the superiority of the upper class, particularly white people in the United States, that they were a racial and intellectual aristocracy, and the Harrimans and the Carnegies thought this was a great idea, and so they agreed to sponsor this whole operation, and they bought the several thousand acre area in Cold Spring Harbor. And it's not an accident, I don't think, that it happened there. Cold Spring Harbor is the heart of the Gold Coast, where all the wealthiest people on Long Island were building these huge estates, and the site of Gatsby's the novel about Gatsby, in terms of it was that society group of people, that social group, that made that area attractive. And also, they needed trainees and volunteers to do all their research. And what better place to go than the bored wives of wealthy New York bankers and lawyers and so forth, that in those big houses along the Gold Coast. And that also was a factor in that decision, I think. But they were also influenced by Francis Galton and Gregor Mendel, who had come up earlier in the 19th century with solid research on the hybridization of pea plants, and noting that the genes you would determine whether it was a pink flower or a blue flower or whatever. And Galton also believed that human qualities such as character, morality, as well as intelligence was passed along from generation to generation through the genes. He's the one, and I think it was in 1883, who coined the term eugenics, from a Greek root meaning, I think, good in birth, something to that effect. And his obsession with Galton in particular was obsessed with numbers and math and computations. And so that was another element that he thought would lead to these conclusions about the size of the brain and and measuring as much as they could all the aspects of the body parts and so forth, to determine height and weight, the length of the arm, the brain cavity, which had been introduced, of course, by Morton. And so they proceeded to look at their laboratory animals, if you will, were actually human informants who they would interview to get information about their family, their health, their education, and so forth. Well, they soon found that people just didn't want to talk to them about that, and they were they were having trouble with this research until I don't know which one it was. I think it was probably Laughlin. It realized that well, we're going to have to work with captive populations. Well, the captive populations were prisons, mental institutions, orphanages, and Indian reservations. Where the populations, first of all, were the first three, the populations had no control over who talked to them and who didn't talk to them. And the people who ran the prisons and the orphanages and the mental institutions, they had already come to this conclusion that race was a factor in the in a sense, the human experience of all these people that they were under their care, if you use the word care. And so these ambitious and young, ambitious bored housewives started going around to those institutions to interview them. And sooner or later, of course, the issue of the Unkechaug and the Shinnecock reservation was going to come up, because the stereotype there was that and it wasn't really a stereotype. Most of the Native American populations on the Atlantic coast had intermarried with African Americans during this early period, and so that became an obsession, and seriously damaged the not only the image, self-image, but also of their access to to jobs and to their own identity as Native Americans. And it made them vulnerable to actions to take their land away from them. If they weren't Indians, why are they on the reservation? These kind of questions inevitably came up. And once again, it's the eugenics ideology of the past that was still alive and still damaging these populations. And so the team that came out to investigate the Unkechaug's all their records are in the files, the eugenics files at the National Institute of Health, right down here near where I am. And those records, again, the history of scientific racism is sort of reflected in that situation. In the 1940s, as soon as the Holocaust, the results of the Nazi ideology became well known, no one wanted to talk about eugenics in this kind of situation, at least in any kind of public forum. And so the records that I finally tracked down had been moved from Cold Spring Harbor to the University of Michigan, because one of the enthusiasts was from Holland, and there was a place in Michigan where a large group of immigrants from Holland had settled in the same community, and therefore he thought he had an example of pure white race that was uninterrupted by any other race or any other. Anyway, that was a theory. Actually, it didn't work out. But those files all went there. After a while, they became sort of, in a sense, an embarrassment to the university archives in Michigan, and so they didn't know what to do with them. They were public records; they couldn't be destroyed, fortunately. And but who wanted them? Well, they ended up in Philadelphia. The Philosophical Association agreed to take some of them, and the National Institute of Health and Medicine down here in Washington took most of the others. The ones from the Unkechaug Reservation and the Shinnecock reservations both were there. This kind of research not only took place not only with here with Long Island, but also with the Lumbee and the Indians along this in Georgia and the Carolinas, and they had volunteers going to those reservations as well, and doing the same kind of research on those populations. So I looked in particular at, as a case study, of a couple of the sets of documents on the Unkechaug and the Shinnecock, but most of my research at that time was working with a book on the Unkechaug. And in 1923, the first team, Harry Laughlin, came out and apparently introduced the trainees to the community. And the Onkachog community was a poor community, and it was an entirely different universe than these women came from, the trainees from on the Gold Coast. They were coming from their fashionable homes with their servants, and they didn't really know how to react or how to deal with the Onkachog families. And the thing that's also shocking about it is their descriptions. For example, in their records, they talk about, we interviewed the inmates who lived in huts on the reservation, and they described the lack of material possessions and the poverty and so forth, without thought, without any making. I hear they were living in one of the richest countries in the world, and they're seeing this here, and that was not in their radar at all to mention any of that. And that's, I think, as appalling as anything else. If anything could be more appalling than what they were doing, but they were dishonest, they were disingenuous. Laughlin, when he came, and Laughlin in particular, when he came to present and to influence, to get the Shinnecock and the Onkachog to go along with this, he assured them that what he was trying to do was to certify that they were in fact pure Indians. And of course, that was not his interest at all. He was interested in showing how the mixed races were inferior to the white race. But they were not told that. And I remember speaking at one time to the mother and aunt of Lance Gumbs, who's one of the speakers in this program, one of the last speakers, Harriet. And Harriet and her sister, I don't know how the conversation came up, but I had not even heard about this. And then they mentioned that, yes, we know about this. She didn't give me that, she didn't know the names, but they came out, and that's what they told me. And Harry Laughlin came several times, and every time he came, he would bring them presents. They came at Christmas, and she mentioned, getting a cake or something like that. So I mean, they were clearly manipulating people who and not telling them what their purpose was in this research. And that is very similar to what was happening back with Mary Sarah, and with the collection and that were being done with under the supervision of Morton and Hurlica. So this continued, and one example from the records that I looked at, they started, in this case, they had moved away from the determining intelligence by the size of the brain cavity. They were looking at the Stanford Binet tests were emerging just about this same time, and so they started to use that test as best they could, but they were not even honest about that. One report was one of the trainees mentioned that she'd given the Stanford Binet test to an Onkachog child in his home, and it was a one-room house with a husband, wife, and I think there were 4 children living in it. And again, she never mentioned how outrageous this was in terms of the poverty within this rich country. That didn't affect her at all. But so she gave the test to several, and she said it was difficult circumstances because there was no table for him to work with. He had to lie on the floor to fill out the forms, and while he was lying there, his brothers and sisters would frequently come by and step over him and so forth. So she said under under very adverse circumstances. But in spite of that, he tested much higher than actually the average white students that were in that test bank. And in a report, she mentioned this, and she said, well, so this obviously is not accurate, so I'm not going to record this. We're going to have to come back and test them again. They never did. But that's just an example of what was going on here, establishing this concept of eugenics. And this was a part of that past that never died. And these publications and this ideology was well received in the press and in the publications, and Davenport and Loffman were frequently contacted by the Nazi scientists in the 1930s who said, yeah, you guys are doing a good job. We want to follow somebody. And the laws that were being passed against interracial marriage, the Germans copied those laws, the Nuremberg laws. And if you may recall, at the trial, the Nuremberg trial, the lawyers defending the Nazis, saying, you Americans, what are you doing coming here punishing us? And these ideas, these race laws that you're bringing up, they're copied from the race laws in 1929 and 1930 in Virginia and in Maryland and areas like that. And it's and that again, I think makes the statement that certifies, if you will, the wisdom of Faulkner's comment. The past is still with us, and that this body information is the ideology that had these consequences. And then, and again, you're reaching here into the area of what we call institutional racism. Here's a classic example of how institutional racism works, because it's just that body of information out there that then has impact on all sorts of other institutions. So the first I'll deal with is the Unkachog School. The Unkachog, in 1875, Chief Ward, the Unkachog sachem, felt there should be a school for the children on the reservation. So he went to the New York State authorities and said, we want to join with the Indian schools, which were just being established on the Iroquois reservation. We want the Algonquian schools to be included. And he won the case. In effect, they agreed to do it. So in 1875, they started the schools. And the schools, however, that were being supervised, the clouds of institutional racism were there. And for example, I went through those records as well up in Albany. The school records were sent every year to Albany with the other Indian schools, and I suspect other public schools that were involved in the state system. And he decided, he's looking at this, and the decisions he made about the schools reflect the consequences of the eugenics thought. He felt that, well, the only suitable teachers would be white people. So he wanted to find white teachers in both the Shinnecock and in the Unkachog school. And for the first years, that was the case. It wasn't until several years later, actually it wasn't until around 1917 that Mildred Eliezer, a Shinnecock woman, was hired to teach at the Unkachog school, followed by another Shinnecock woman, Dora Bund, and then finally Lua Ogburn. And they were very successful teachers, and there was some change of heart as a result of that. But the decisions about school, books, and so forth was all reflected these biases, racial biases, and this is also true with with other aspects of the school, the running of the school, and so forth. The primary goal, and I think this was true with the Iroquois as well, was that they were producing young people who would work in menial jobs. They were not producing young people who were going to go on to college. The Indian schools were concentrating just on the elementary grades, and that reflected the ideological burden, consequences, if you will, that was deeply rooted in the eugenics movement. But in the process of this, the eugenics movement was beginning to build a methodological base that was rooted in the concept of racial norms, that the white race has certain characteristics that are norms, the African American certain norms, and the Indian. The leading anthropologists of the day, Franz Boas and Melville Herkowitz, debunked these things. Said, no, this is ridiculous. There's no such thing as a racial norm. And Boas was saying, you people don't understand what race is. And once again, it was the a priori approach, what they were just looking for some kind of evidence to make their case. Well, once they established these norms, they then proceeded to bring up charts to determine what percentage of a particular, in this case, for the Shinnecock and the Unkachug, what percentage of the mixed races were predominant. And I think I have a set of tables. Is that, Sandy, if you could put that up, table 1 and table, yeah, here we go. These were the norms that you can see that they came up with. And this was all based on the questionable and arbitrary decisions made with the numbers that they had. But this was based on what Galton would say solid mathematical data, and they were measuring, for example, the head breadth, if you will, of all the Unkachaws. They're doing this up and down the coast with other Indian groups. The stature, what the normal stature was, which again you can see the obvious problems there. The nose breadth, how wide the nasal features were, the hair form, and the lip thickness. That was, and sometimes they couldn't get the recordings to set it up anyway. So they had all these norms about here are the absolute individual measurements for all human beings, and then here are the norms within that, within those reasons. So on the basis of this, if you go to the next slide, Sandy, table 2, there we go. Here we're going to decide the individuals. Now the names. When I went to do the research at the National Institute of Health, I signed several forms agreeing not to publicize any names, which I wouldn't have done anyway. And so that's why you see the numbers 1, 2, 3. This individual, they said 23% Indian, 12% white, 50% black. Sometimes they didn't always add up to 100. And then the Indian, white, and so and these were all the categories, and and then so they would look at an individual that they would look at who maybe was clearly evenly mixed or whatever, and then they would once they got their names, they then would go to the tests, intelligence tests and health records and arrest records and so forth, and their correlation, which of course was like all correlations, they're very questionable. It's not really a good source of data. I always remember one of my professors talking about the absolute correlation between an increase in faculty salaries in a given university town and the increase of profits in the local liquor store in that same community. And there's a correlation. You can prove it. So if you give these faculty members more money, they're just going to go out and spend it on booze. I mean, it's that kind of correlation we're talking about here. What I cited here is sort of a humorous example, but these were serious stuff. These were serious damaging impacts that it had, because they were using that to attack, if you will, the reservations themselves. And so this is a database that we're working with. Now I'm not going to spend any more time with those. I'm going to go to look at one of the specific case studies. The attempt to close the Indian school was based on these statistics. Now, but they went beyond this. They appointed a guy, his name was Haig. He was the director of the Indian schools, particularly the Algonquian schools on Long Island. And he got some information, false information, as it were, from somebody in another area, the legal department of education in New York State, who told him that the Unkachog had never been recognized by the state of New York. And therefore, the state of New York had no business taking public money and spending on education for Indian children. So there you see another example of the threat that comes from the eugenics documents and ideology and so forth. But fortunately, some of the members of the Unkachog and some of the local people on Long Island, ministers came to and even town board members and justices came to the defense of the Unkachog, saying that no, that's not true. You're misinterpreting everything. We finally got the Attorney General of New York to come to I think one of the head of the Long Island Presbytery approached the Attorney General and about this, and the Attorney General looked into it, and he published a response noting that the New York State government has never. I'm sorry. Somebody, I thought I heard somebody. Okay, never mind. The
John, you have to unmute. John?
Oh, everything looks different now.
You were muted, so
How did that happen?
don't have a clue.
Well,
when the computer goes. But
Yeah. Well, some people may have been happy.
oh, no,
You couldn't hear me.
no. But I think we all want to hear what you said.
Well, of course, I don't know when I was muted. So I was talking
You were
about,
muted at the point, hello, John, you were muted at the point where you said New York State had never.
that was, so that was, yeah, okay.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Harry.
So it wasn't that long ago. So you didn't miss it. Anyway, and they made that statement and that there was no reason. And then what the irony is that when we jump up to Sandy's experience with the Montaukets about restoring their state recognition is ironic and ahistorical. They don't have to. It was never taken away. It was never given. I mean, always. But the state of New York, by the way, now is apparently not accepting that. We raised that point to the Attorney General. I don't know, a few months ago, or maybe last year. I've forgotten. And they didn't pay. They didn't. I didn't get a response. But technically, and of course, I think there was a problem of the legal expenses for whatever. Well, that's just another one of the consequences. I don't want to get too far involved or distracted with those things. But the Faulkner, the wisdom of the Faulkner saying is in a sense legitimized or underscored or supported with that example as well. But I'm going to try to get back and focus mainly on the Unkechaug. But in effect, the school was saved. This was in 1935, and no sooner had that been settled and that the state attorney general had issued this in public, then a wealthy family who owned the property all around the Unkechaug Reservation, the Floyd family, one of their sons, William Shepherd Dana, was, I'll explain the name. I don't want to go into why the name is different, but Dana was the son, and he wanted to get involved with the development of the property all around what is now Mastic in that area in central Long Island. And his strategy was to try to close down the reservation so he could get all that land and turn it into exclusive apartments and so forth, who would certainly not want to have the pocket of poverty on the Indian reservation as their neighbors. So he decided that the best way to do it was to simply evict a couple of young married couple. Unkechaug, a couple had recently gotten married, and they wanted to build their house on the reservation, which of course was commonly done. Dana comes in and said, no, you're trespassing on my property, and you can't build your houses there. And he filed an eviction notice with the county to have them removed. And of course, immediately there was a legal response to that, and it went to court. And the Dana family got some very impressive and high-priced lawyers to build this case. And what they did was, here we go again. They said, well, the Unkechaug are not real Indians. They're mainly Black. That's the term they used. And and in addition to that, they never had any recognition, and that even though that had just been debunked, their main attack was the racial one. And so once again, they went to court, and the the argument that they were intermarried with inferior races, they lost their Indianness. That was presented in the court as supporting the eviction notice. And that they were not only, but that they were, and they were certainly not Indians. Well, one of the interesting testimonies that came up and again, it's interesting that the members of the town justice, members of the town board, and local ministers came to the defense of the Unkachog, and the county supervisor or the administrator of the draft board testified. He said, you realize that none of the Unkachog had to go to war, had to have experience in the military, because they were not citizens. They were exempt from the draft. That's why. And then he said, but in spite of that, several of the young Unkachog men went to fight in World War I anyway. So that created an area of support, if you will, for the Unkachog. The fact that they had gone to war, but the thing that was interesting was that the statement that they're not citizens didn't really seem to resonate. People were surprised. But Indians were not citizens until, I think, 1926. No Indians, there were some that had been granted this in different parts of the United States, but overall, there was no federal law which granted Indians citizenship, which is another interesting, ironic aspect to all this. But what happened was that because of all this, and because of the local support they got, and because of the documents indicating that they indeed had a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, or in this case, with the colonial government before the whites had arrived, blocked that attempt to close the reservation. Now, this 1936 is when so many things were happening to the Unkachog that were related to the residue, if you will, of the aspects of institutional racism. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had just undergone some significant changes under Roosevelt in 1935-36. He appointed the head of the Indian Affairs in the Department of the Indian. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is in the Department of the Interior, and Roosevelt appointed John Collier to take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he appointed Collier because Collier was a solid Democrat, but Collier also believed that the centuries-old policy for dealing with Indians was wrong and was not working. It started with John Eliot at the Indian towns in 1650 in Massachusetts. The idea was to civilize by pressure, if you will, the Indians to the mantra that was used for the next 200 or 300 years was kill the Indian and save the man, to convert them all to become Christians and bring them into the European economy, and there'd be no more need for reservations. And so that was so Collier argued that no, the reservation should not be a way to change the Indian culture. On the contrary, the Indian reservation's goal should be to preserve Indian culture, Indian language, and to create, if you will, a real refuge, cultural refuge for Native American people. And many people were enthusiastic about that and supported it. There were still those that, particularly the Christian missionaries and so forth, they didn't like this because they had for them, the Indian reservations were a captive audience where they could uh, work on the missionary work and conversion and so forth. So that was always there in the background. But the main issue that impacted on the Unkechaug, the Shinnecock, Montaukett, and all of these Indians groups along the coast that had intermarried with blacks was that Collier believed that Indians, if they didn't look like the Pueblo and the Hopi, they were not really Indians. Collier himself was born in Mississippi and grew up in Alabama and had similar views about African American people. And so he refused to allow the reservations, the ones I've just mentioned, and all up and down the coast from the Pequots all the way down to the Lumbee in the south and the Seminole in Florida. All those were not invited to this what became federal recognition programs. Now, federal recognition then began to take shape, and it meant that if you were officially recognized by the federal government, you would get health care, legal benefits, educational benefits, all of these, and the support of the and protection for your sovereignty against being sued by private sources and so forth. All these benefits were denied. And once again, here's one of the consequences of the eugenics movement. They used that to block their access to federal recognition, and that's still a problem because that still has not been remedied. Even in the case of so the Shinnecock, the Montaukett, and the Unkechaug, who had clear historical nation-to-nation, and I talk about colonial America to Indian relationships, which has always been the criteria for federal recognition. Federal recognition was meant that this institution, this agency, in a sense, had an official sovereign relationship. And indeed, the Indian tribes were defined as nations by John Marshall in the early, from the colonial times on. So that was another example of the disadvantages that accrue from institutional racism, and this was the one area where institutional racism was very difficult to offset. The Shinnecock finally did, through a lot of work and hard work and research, to get federal recognition. But the Unkechaug never got that full recognition. Of course, the Montauketts were ignored entirely, even though they had, you could argue, a very strong case because of their history with the colonial government and even to some extent with the state of New York. But so that's an example of the consequences that were never really overcome. The Unkechaug did manage, again, full of ironies, if you will. The next threat came from to the Unkechaug, based again on these ideologies, was Gristedes Foods sued the Unkechaug reservation for a loss of profits in their stores, food stores, because the Unkechaug smoke shops were selling untaxed cigarettes, and the Gristedes lawyers decided to sue them in federal court because they knew the Unkechaug only had state reservations. So they knew that they couldn't sue an Indian tribe that had federal recognition, because all the Indian tribes, Indian nations were exempt because they had that they were sovereign nations. John Marshall had ruled that all of the Indian nations are dependent nations. They are in a separate category. We have states and counties and the federal government, and we've got another body of another agency that we define as a dependent nation. There are all sorts of legal aspects that are related to that. But so when Aristides did this, Jim Simmelmeyer and Chief Wallace of the Uncachog said, well, argued that we should have sovereignty from this as well. But the judge said, well, if the only way you can justify having sovereign exemption is to show that you meet the official standards which were set by the Supreme Court. Once again, we're going back to 1909, 1905, and so forth, in a Supreme Court case entitled Montoya versus the United States. And in this particular case, a rancher named Montoya was suing the U.S. government because his cows had been killed by the Apaches. Victoria, an Apache war leader, left the reservation. The Apaches were always doing this and raiding local farmers and so forth. And and it reached a point where the Apache became pretty close to an all-out war. The raiders were roving around in New Mexico and Arizona, and the troops were sent out after them. They couldn't find them, and this went on for actually for a couple of years before Victoria was finally killed in Mexico. So the Montoya said that I lost my cattle, and the Apache Indians did it, and the Apache Indians are dependent states. They are your dependents. In other words, if your children break my windows, I'm going to sue you because you're going to have to pay for it. And it said the same thing. The Apache were the dependent nations, the children of the U.S. government. The government at the time, they were talking about the area at the turn of the century, said, no, the Apaches that killed your cattle were actually acting as independent nations. They were not our dependent nations. They were a foreign power. And this is a war between the United States and a foreign entity. Therefore, we're not responsible if the soldiers from a foreign army kill your cattle. That was the State Department of Washington's defense. And so in order to settle this, they had to decide, well, what in legal terms is an Indian nation anyway? It had never been defined. Anthropologists had never agreed much on it. And so after a bit of finagling, and by the way, the judge in this case, the Montoya case, was John Brown, who had just recently ruled on the separate but equal clause in terms of schools and so forth in the South. Whether he was an absolute racist or not, I don't know. At least in this case, he ruled that, or the government lawyers, and so came up with a definition that an Indian nation is a group of people made up of the same or similar, that was an interesting clause, same or similar race, living in a more or less defined territory, and have a political organization and structure that has survived, in effect, from the time before the whites came to today. That's what an Indian reservation is. It has to have a history of existence before the Europeans came. And so the judge, who this story has a lot of ironies in, the judge who was actually the first woman of Asian descent in the 10th district, federal district in Manhattan, which is one of the more prestigious districts. And this was her first case. They assigned her that case. Whether they had any thoughts or any sense of history or irony, I have no idea. But she looked at this and she said, well, she said, you are not federally recognized by the US government. And if you want this kind of immunity, you have to show that you qualify under the Supreme Court ruling definitions of an Indian or Indian tribe. She said, you have to prove to me with a preponderance of evidence that you meet those qualifications of prehistoric existence, continuous tribal or structure and organization and so forth, and consistent location, so on. So I served as the expert witness for the Onkachog in that case, and what we did, I didn't do it by myself. We had a lot of help. That I had to show that all the deeds which were there in the town records, indicating that the colonial government had this relationship with the Onkachog, or that people representing the colonial government had signed treaties. So we had all sorts of treaties and documentations and other kinds of labor contracts for the whaling and so forth, which indicated clearly that that they existed before. And then we had a more difficult one was to show there was a consistent organizational structure that worked and that did what governments have to do in a small nation or independent nation or whatever. And of course, they always lived there. There never been any challenge about that. And they had there had been no evidence that the group had ever moved anywhere. There were many people, many Onkachog, who were living off the reservation in local communities and so forth. And we gathered all that data from the census rolls and so forth. And so we did what we presented what she acknowledged was a preponderance of evidence. And so we got de facto federal recognition. Now that's an interesting term, and no one really knows what that actually means. I think we may be, the Onkachog may be the only Indian nation that has de facto recognition. Now, what that means is that in any case brought against the Onkachog by in a federal court, it will they are immune from that suit. And she dismissed Gristides' case, and she said no, they have no constitutional right to sue the Onkachog because they are, by the Supreme Court decision, an Indian tribe. The problem is that the de facto means that it only extends to the Supreme Court, to federal court. There's any in the federal court, and so that still left the question hanging. Well, what about now getting the health care and education and all the other benefits? And she said this does not apply to that. It only applies to sovereign immunity from suit by private agencies against them for any kind of whatever charge might be brought. So they're left there now in that limbo, and it's full of ironies. They met the definition of the Supreme Court, but the other criteria that were set by John Collier were in a different branch of the government. They were in the executive branch of the government. The federal Collier was an agent in the Department of the Interior, and they had by this time had come up with their own criteria. The other problem posed for the Onkachog and for the other groups without federal recognition is that the reservations that were getting federal recognition beginning in the 1980s were beginning to go into the casino business. And so all the local state authorities and so forth were very cautious about any tribe getting federal recognition because there was a body of information, a body of resistance that had already organized, beginning with the resistance against the Pequots in the 1980s, that the not in your backyard sort of organization, if you will. And so whenever any kind of question was raised, and this is a big problem for the Shinnecocks as well. They managed to overcome it, but the suspicion was always there that all this is bogus. That you're not really Indians, you just want a casino. So once again, the "you're not really Indians" comes to the surface, and it reinforces all the other negative ideology or biases against non-white peoples. And that was the I guess the latest, if you will, in the assaults that that result as consequences of the eugenics ideology. So, and it's still there. I mean, the Onkachog are still out there, and so are Native American groups down here where I am, in the Roanoke area, and the groups down here and down into Florida and into some of the other southern states, Alabama, and so forth. Many groups there have not received the kind of benefits that they deserve. So, well, let me stop there and open up the questions.
Yep. If you have a question, just go in and raise your hand. But Marguerite Smith sent me a couple of questions earlier today, and I noticed that she did come on, Marguerite. So if you could ask your question.
Okay.
Marguerite, unmute.
Hi, John. Hi, everybody. Or Akwe, for those of you who took the language class. John, I'm sorry that I had to miss the earlier parts of the meeting, but I was curious about, I don't know how much you talked about the eugenics, sir, the actual process of going to people's homes and really invading personal space, personal privacy, as the eugenics went. Did you talk about that much?
Well, I spoke about it in some detail with the Onkachog, but well, by the way, first, Marguerite, how are you doing? I haven't talked to you in a long time.
I know. We'll catch up. We'll catch up.
Okay.
I'm okay. Thank you.
Here's Marguerite. I did talk to Harriet Gums and her sister, and it wasn't a planned. I mentioned that here earlier, that Harriet had mentioned that she didn't have. It's kind of interesting. She didn't have negative responses because she didn't really realize, I think, even what was going on. She was told. Now, this is where you get to the question of unethical behavior with the eugenics movement.
Right.
She and her sister were told that the reason that Harry Laughlin was one of the top organizers in the eugenics movement, and Davenport, and I think she wasn't sure of the name, but I'm pretty sure it was that was Laughlin that did it, because he also had taken a photograph of the Shinnecock reservation, and you got the impression that he never actually did much more than that. But she said, yes, he did come, and he courted them. And she said she remembered at Christmas time, he came with a cake and presents and so on. And he continually flattered them by telling them, we're going to prove that you are real Indians, that you're certified, when he was not doing that at all. He was trying to show that as inferior, as mixed races, that was the whole organizing purpose of the eugenics movement. I mean, they were trying to prove their preconceived notions. Yeah, so that's all I remember. And also I'll say, Marguerite, that when I got those, I got all the data that was, or made copies of it, that was down here in the National Museum of Health and Education here in Silver Spring, and I collected, and I signed several waivers which said I couldn't use names, which I wasn't going to do anyway, and that I couldn't publish. I've forgotten, they had some term about I couldn't reveal the names to, not only not publish them, I couldn't reveal the new names to anybody. And so, but when I got thinking about this, when I got home, and I said, well, I really have to reveal the names to the people that I know on the reservation of those same names. And so I decided to, I took all the stuff I had that had a name involved with the show, most all the stuff anyway, and I took it to Josephine, to Josephine Smith, and I remember sitting in her living room, on a kitchen table, I guess, and I passed all those things out, and I said, you can, I think they should be here in the Shinnecock files, and and she said she was going to return them, and at least to notify the families that this has happened. I mean, very few of the families knew about this. Now Harriet did, but I never talked to any of the others. You might speak with Josephine about that.
Well, I mean, that's why they have something these days called an institutional review board. And when you're going to do research on humans, the institution is supposed to go through a process, an agreement concerning privacy and all those things. I mean, I actually had my mother's direct conversation. My mother clearly remembered them coming into the living room, clearly remembered them examining them and measuring noses and hair and all that sort of thing. So, we had very personal stories, and we got the material from Cold Spring Harbor or whoever they'd sent whatever it is they still had. So, we have gathered all of that within the nation. But again, one of the things that's always been curious for me is, as you talked about, what kind of ethics govern these people who just barge into people's homes? What were they told? You've answered the question. Sandy should send you the questions I asked. Were there inducements? Was there any compensation? Were there any promises?
No, nothing. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that they even took that seriously. The privacy or the humanity of those people, and the records that see, now I don't know when it was that you went there, but when I first started, David Martin was one of the first to alert me to this, and and that's when I went to Cold Spring Harbor, and at that time they said they didn't have any of them. Now this was what, 1980 or something like that. I'm sorry, not 2017, no, I forget. I'm sorry. I think around 2015.
We'd probably gotten the material from them at that point.
Well, that could be. She of course did not mention anything like that. But you did the files down there on the Shinnecock were filled a whole file box, And,
Oh, yeah, yeah. And
and
we had great
so,
detail.
I'm surprised that there was anything left that you could, there for you to pick up when you came. But anyway, that's not the point.
Well, you said you were there into the
Yeah,
2000s.
yeah,
We probably went
yeah.
before. We probably got the material before, but that's okay. The point is there are different standards. The point
Oh, well,
is
that's the point. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
point is that people who are oppressed find themselves, the oppression continues and takes different forms at different times. The deception takes different forms at different times. So that who invites someone into their living room to measure their nose or
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But
it's not something you normally do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you
And-
find cases in which, and you may have discussed this earlier, did you find
no,
cases
because I was
in
hoping
which
you
the
came
eugenic
on. so we
studies
could
were
ask.
actually cited?
I'm sorry. You're both talking. I don't know what to.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I asked you, are there any cases locally or nationally in which the eugenic studies are actually used in describing Native people in various parts?
I don't think they were thoroughly discredited in terms
Okay.
of any kind of public use. They were not
Okay.
discredited in terms of, I mean, you look around, you see today the politicization of these issues. All that eugenic stuff is widely voiced, but not in any official legal capacity.
Right.
But I had and I've experienced the new rules and so forth. I think it was about 2000, I don't know, 10 or so. I served as a thesis advisor for a young woman who was doing her PhD thesis in Stony Brook, and she was interviewing Unkachog people, and and she told me that she had to sign all these papers, and she said, if you want to use some of this, and I think I did use some of her data, I had to take a series of tests to make sure I understood what the laws were. I had to
Right.
read the laws on the computer, and then I had to say, yes, I understand this, and then I would get certified or whatever. And but that's what's going on now. And this was since 2010 or something. If you do any research, and she was very careful, and the women she talked to, she had to explain everything to them. And there's another, particularly in her case, but she could use it for a dissertation. But if she were to share it with another scholar, that scholar had to go through this too, which was what I was doing. But I was able to use some of that data in the book. The big irony for me is that I went through all this research with the health, the eugenics records, and it was after I published a book on the Unkachog about the court case. I get all that sent off to the publisher, and a year later, all this comes. And so that was why it ended up in this paper. I had a lot of that stuff. I never published it anywhere. I wanted to get it out, but I wrote an article about this, which was highly critical of John Collier, and it got rejected.
And John,
by one of the peer review readers, the editor, anyway. Okay.
yeah, John, we only have a few minutes left. I know, I know Chief Harry Wallace of the Unkachugs has been trying to raise his hand.
Okay.
And the other people, I got their questions, and I'm going to email them to you so you can answer them directly, because we want to kind of, after Harry's question, call it an evening.
What?
So Philip
I'm interested to see Harry's question.
Pardon me?
I said I'm interested to hear Harry's question.
Hear Harry's question. Harry, can you unmute?
Sure. Hey, John, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Harry?
I'm doing all right. Okay. So I disagree with you. I don't think that eugenics has been discredited at all officially. I believe that it is still the policy of the government to
Harry,
sustain that.
my point was that in the legal areas, they're not much credit, but it's certainly that was I agree with you. This is what Faulkner was saying when he said the past is never past. These ideas are so attractive to in a racial context that they're not going to go away and they're going to continue forever. Well, who knows? Causing.
Okay, so what my
damage.
question, John, was you talked a little bit about this reverse scientific racism, right?
Yeah, upside
Now,
down.
has that been articulated as a foundation for challenging this process of eugenics? Is that
that scientific method has been thoroughly discredited, and it was actually that scientific method, Harry, at the time, Franz Boas and Russell Herkovitz, the established anthropologists, debunked it then. They pointed out that what Davenport and Lawton are doing is unscientific. There's no such thing as racial norms, and this is all bogus. And so that's always been there. I think that the important point, I suppose, is as what one you're suggesting, is that Faulkner is saying the past is not dead. The past is never past. This is evidence that that's exactly true. The laws can limit the damage, but the psychologically the damage is going to continue, and it's going to be serious, as it was here. All the Unkechaug struggling, and he finally won. And if you look at those cases, the attempt to close the school and the attempt to close the reservation, a number of the judges, the legal authority, they laid that out. They said, you know, that in the town justice and so forth. So that the ideology has a limited appeal, but it's a powerful undertow that creates all these difficulties. You know, we have
Well,
to.
those aren't. They didn't make legal decisions. They made political decisions against us. Those were not legal decisions.
Yeah,
But anyway,
and,
John, it's good to hear from you.
Yeah, good to hear from you, Harry.
And we're going to have to bring this to a close. And there's a number of questions that I've asked Heather to get to me, print out and get to me, and I'll get to you, John, so you can answer them offline to people. But
Okay.
Cynthia, are you, and thank you so much. You know, we could go on for another hour, but thank you. And Cynthia, you want to bring it?
Yes, all right. And I shall say thank you, John. As Sandy said, we could go on for another hour. And luckily, it's very nice to meet Harry Wallace and Marguerite Smith, who will be with us in our next series. Marguerite will be with us on September 21st, and Harry, you'll be with us on November 18th. So it's very nice to meet you. I welcome you back. All of you in the audience and their participations. Yes, please send us your questions. Sandy is very organized. She said she would get them to John and get the answers back to you, and she will do that. So I want to thank all of you who are here. It's a pleasure. And yes, we could go on talking for another few hours, not just another half hour. So join us again. Our next program is Thursday, September 21st on Zoom. So watch our emails, and Sandy does a great job of reaching out, and we appreciate that. And again, thank you very much, Sandy, and thank you very much, John. It was amazing.